Hey everyone, we'll wait just a couple minutes so everyone can get logged in and get their audio working because I know sometimes Zoom will let you in, but your audio doesn't work. So we'll wait just a few minutes and then we'll get started. Great, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hey y'all, I'm AJ, good afternoon. We're thrilled to be presenting a timely panel entitled COVID-19, Virtual Classrooms and Institutional Barriers, sponsored by the ABA Commission on Disability Rights and Section on Civil Rights and Social Justice. This panel is one of the many in a series of rapid response webinars. We are actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues. So please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A feature, not the chat function. If you do not see the controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. We will address questions at the end of the panel. We will be sharing a recording of this program to everyone who is registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. And with that, we're thrilled to bring you today's program entitled COVID-19, Virtual Classrooms and Institutional Barriers. I'd like to introduce the panelists. My name is AJ, like I said. I am AJ Link. I am one of the co-presidents of the National Disabled Law Students Association. And our panelists today are Ellie Cowen, Associate Director of Outreach at the National Disabled Law Students Association. Ellie is a rising 2L at the University of Idaho School of Law. Ellie just transferred and her experience will focus on her previous law school, not her experiences at her new institution. Our second panelist is Jeremy Wertz. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, class of 2020, and he is also a co-president of the National Disabled Law Students Association. Our third panelist is Maria Zavaleta. She's a rising 3L at the University of San Francisco School of Law. And with that, I will turn it over to Maria.
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for having me today. Like AJ mentioned, my name is Maria Zavaleta. I'm a rising 3L at the University of San Francisco School of Law, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, ella. I'm very excited to be here and thankful to all of the organizations that are working to promote a more disability-inclusive law school environment. I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder combined presentation, and what that means is that I am both inattentive and hyperactive. And I share this for two reasons. One is because when I was considering law school, I was very apprehensive about reporting my condition because I thought that somehow my symptoms could be used against me either in law school or through my legal career. And I feel like this is a common fear among law students with disabilities. And sometimes this fear may make it difficult for them to speak up about issues, especially during this time. And two, because my testing accommodations are invaluable in order for me to be in an equal footing with my peers. Now, many of you are here today because you want to know what your institutions can do to change in order to be more inclusive to students with disabilities. And I think that if you target the issues that we'll discuss throughout this webinar, then you'll be working towards that change. And you'll be promoting an environment where students are more comfortable about sharing this aspect of their identity, and that prepares them for success, not only through law school, but in their legal careers. And now I want to talk to you about my experiences pre-COVID and through COVID that I hope may guide your institutional changes. So I'll be talking to you about 6 things: health insurance, no laptop rules, wellness events, MPRE bar exam, a need for community, and a lack of proper accommodations during COVID. Now, as for health insurance, the first year of law school, we all know, is particularly challenging. We're all trying to figure out how to read a case, how to brief a case, how to prepare for class, how hypo should be written, etc. And amidst all this first year stress, students with disabilities also have to figure out how to get a doctor in their new city. I was so stressed out my first year of law school that it wasn't until I was running out of medication that I actually started looking into how my health insurance worked. And I think that, especially right now through this virtual learning environment, new challenges arise where students are again relocating and they may need additional support with regards to health insurance. And as for one else, I think that health insurance training should be something that's embedded into their orientation and is heavily emphasized. Now, as for the no laptop rules, many students with disabilities have software in their computers that supports them. And no laptop rules do two things: stigmatize students with disabilities in two ways. First of all, it forces you to either sit in the back of the row in the back of the classroom in order to actually use your laptop, or it outs you to your classmates who can only guess that the reason why you're using a laptop is because you have an accommodation pursuant to a disability. And I think that students shouldn't be forced to make this choice between having to sit in the front of the class or having their laptop. I personally like to sit in the very first row because, as somebody with ADHD, it helps minimize distractions for myself. And like I said, no student with disabilities should have to be forced to make this choice. And the third thing, wellness events. For some reason, I feel like there's this distinction between wellness events and disability services. My particular law school actually has a lot of wellness events where we talk about mental health, and there's therapy dogs at the law library, etc. And all of that is amazing and it's great. But I think that we should focus on promoting both wellness and disability services where we talk about resources for students as to testing accommodations, etc. There shouldn't be this distinction between the two. The fourth thing is the MPRE and the bar exam. I think that we need to acknowledge that due to limited family resources and perhaps cultural barriers, some students may not have been diagnosed and evaluated for their condition until later in life. And that means that these students didn't test with accommodations for either the SAT, the ACT, and perhaps the LSAT. And so law schools need to be more supportive to students who may have this, you know, to whom this may have happened, because the MPRE and the bar exam have such a heavy weight on a history of testing with accommodations. So I think that even right now, as we navigate virtual learning and everyone is remote, there needs to be workshops where students are informed as to how to navigate getting testing accommodations, especially since the bar exam and the MPRE may look different than they have before. The fifth thing is a need for community. Does your law school have an organization for students with disabilities? Do you offer disability law or any related course? Does your career services office talk to students about how to seek accommodations with their employers? If your answer is no, or I don't know to any of these questions, then you need to start critically considering how to address those problems, because it's those resources that make students like myself feel supported rather than stigmatized. And the last thing is a lack of proper testing accommodations during COVID time. As I mentioned, I have ADHD, and part of my accommodations consist of testing in a distraction-reduced environment. And this last semester, I was actually told multiple times that the school wasn't able to accommodate that because of this shelter-in-place or stay-at-home order. And I think that, as we move towards the fall semester that likely will be remote or have some sort of hybrid program, schools need to start looking for solutions in order to support their students and accommodate them completely. And if you have a hybrid program, be careful as to how that's interpreted by your students, because you don't want somebody who requires certain testing accommodations to feel forced to go back to school just because, they may think that's the only way for them to get their accommodations. And if you're fully remote, think about alternatives such as seeking testing centers, or maybe even outreaching to other law schools that may be open to having students test at their law library, or even outreaching to your alumni that may be willing to host a student through an exam. And if you're an alumni, be willing to host a student for an exam. I think that we're at a time where we shouldn't just hope to go back to normal, because normal wasn't working in many different ways. And I think that this is an opportunity to consider positive changes to legal education. But while we navigate this virtual/remote learning environment, you need to do right by students with disabilities and find solutions that will help them succeed. Thank you. And now Jeremy's going to talk to you all.
I think we're pivoting to Ellie next, if I believe.
Yes, we'll let Ellie with the E speak. Ellie, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'm Ellie Cowen. I'm a Rising 2L, going to be starting at University of Idaho, which I'm very excited about. Pronouns she and her. And I have had an interesting first year at law school, especially with COVID and all that response, along with earthquakes and my law school closing. So it's a very unique experience for me, and challenges that have been presented, and opportunities that I think that we can grow a lot from the COVID experience. And so one of the first things I wanted to talk about was the access to accommodations at law school. Prior to COVID, the access to accommodations it's a lot of extra steps and time. There are a lot of extra costs for different documentation, new documentation. I had to go get new documentation to prove that I've had hearing loss for the last 10 years. And it's not like your hearing is going to come back. And so these extra steps make it difficult to stay on top of everything you have to do for law school in the first place. And that's important for this piece, in that there's the idea at law schools that students with disabilities are receiving an unfair advantage. And number one, it's a equity issue, not an equality issue, and we're just being raised up to have equal access to the education. It is our work, it is things like that. So for me, my accommodation, because I have the hearing loss and an auditory processing disorder, is an ability to have my classes recorded and receive a note taker. This was just getting put into place second semester prior to COVID, like 3 days before we were dismissed. And then as we went into the COVID time, it was great because the professors were recording the Zoom classes and posting them on Twin. I didn't have to worry about how to record them and everything else. And that was wonderful. And there was access for everybody. Previously, they said they couldn't provide recordings for me because it would give me an unfair advantage. When we went into COVID, all of a sudden it was available to everybody and it was posted up there for everybody. I've gone back this last week and checked with some of my professors to find out how many people went back and watched the videos afterwards, after class, that he had posted that we're recording. And on average, he said 3 out of 60 students in a class went back and accessed them. So even if it was there, nobody's taking an extra advantage of it, even if they have access. Along with the access to the videos and recorded lectures, there were all sorts of other resources put out for those dealing with COVID. There was, counseling services for those who were dealing with anxiety and stress, and financial resources and medical resources, and all this, very inclusive, inviting environment for all students going through COVID. However, none of these resources were available to students with disabilities prior to that. There was no assigned advisor that you could talk to. There was nobody they could refer you to, no support group at our school. One of the things to me, as I was dealing with some of this, is I spoke with our student success center, and one of the sad things she said to me was there were so many students with disabilities that come through and she can't point them to anybody. She can't refer them to anybody because she can't disclose anything. And they're isolated and alone and discouraged and anxious. And these are the same issues that they're going out of their way to help with those dealing with COVID. So it is interesting, the dynamic that the resources and the ideas were already there. It just, they weren't interested in implementing these for disability services, only when everybody had the opportunity. For me, this stretches beyond, COVID, in that I remember at university in the 2016 election, and when Trump won the presidency, the university that I was at had extra centers and counseling and grief centers for people to deal with the upset of over Trump becoming president. And while I understand there would be, some people are going to get emotional, this seemed like an disproportionate response when there was people with disabilities that didn't have access to these things in the first place. And now we're giving credits for absences and everything else because you didn't like how the election turned out. So this seems like resources are there. They just don't want to acknowledge the needs in the disability students and put the effort behind it. There's a disconnect there. They know how to do it. They know it works, but it's not seen for everybody. So that just sets everybody off on even more uneven footing. The other thing that stood out to me then is talking about the unfair advantage. And this is something that I heard at my previous law school time and time again. You're going to be getting an unfair advantage. That was the first sentence out of my accommodations advisor's mouth when I went to meet with him. The very first thing, our primary goal is to make sure you do not receive any unfair advantages. But this is a perception that we really need to work on. It's a systemic problem. And I'm going to give you an absolutely ridiculous example, but the ridiculousness of it will illustrate how we need to change thinking. So if you're standing at an elevator with a group of people and a individual in a wheelchair, the students are not thinking, wow, he's getting an unfair advantage because he doesn't have to carry his law books. He doesn't have to go up and down the stairs. He doesn't have to go all the campus. He's not going to be exhausted from all the walking around during class. So he's going to be better able to pay attention and everything else. But the fact that he gets to sit in the wheelchair all day is an unfair advantage. That's just ridiculous. But it's the same thing applied to other disabilities. The guy in the wheelchair probably wants nothing more than to get up and carry his books up the stairs and be able to be more accessible to different things and not deal with the daily adjustments that he has to make to his accessibility to things. And it is pointing out and making people aware of these misperceptions in what is and what isn't an advantage. Yeah. So I know it's ridiculous, but it's something that can be seen. I mean, I also have ADD. I was told, well, if you just try to concentrate harder, and it's like the advisor telling me this, I said, how about you take off your glasses and you just squint harder and then you'll be able to see the board. It doesn't work like that. This is a legitimate disability. You can't take away the aids there. And so part of this is having that discussion that it's not an unfair advantage, especially when they're willing to put these things in place when conditions are not ideal for everybody. When it's not ideal for everybody, we've got all these options for you. But when it's just the small minority who has disability issues and access issues, that's not an option. And we really found out that that is not the case. Spring semester, everything was online and stuff. When it came to register for accommodations for summer semester, my previous recording had been to only use my smart pen. Can't do the smart pen when they require you to wear a headset. The pen can't hear anything to record. So then they gave me a clunky walk around and how to hook the pen up to the computer to record, and I had to have my microphone turned off, and it's like a 3 to 5 minute switch off. So if the teacher called on me or I wanted to do something, I had to undo all that in order to participate. And the teacher said, it takes too long, you're just going to be out the participation points. And when I talked to accommodations about it, it was well, it's not that many points, so don't worry about it. Which, if you don't have access to points, it's not equal access. It doesn't matter how many points there are. But there were easy solutions. The previous semester had been recorded and posted online. I suggested this. That was not an option. Allow me to record the Zoom, giving me permission, and then I don't have that issue. That was not. It was these extra steps that they had to put in place that take extra time and prevent me from having that equal access that the school went with. And so it's like, okay, we can make all these things happen for COVID and everybody, but now that it's an accommodation issue and not a COVID issue, it doesn't matter that there's all these extra things and it's unfair access. And that's a systemic problem and attitude within this. A lot of times for those of us who are receiving accommodations, there is so much extra work that you have to do, everything from doctor's appointments to documentation, meetings with the EAC, and it's time consuming. Takes time out of studying. and there's a lack of support. The staff and faculty really don't want to hear anything about accommodations for fear of FERPA and HIPAA violations and it causing problems with anonymity of grading and stuff. And so it's all part of this big problem that relates. And it, again, we go back to it isolates the students and leaves them discouraged and very hopeless with no place to go, which is something else that we're putting money into to helping those who are dealing with the COVID, results. And I think from that, the COVID provides us an opportunity to say, hey, these things are all possible and we can do this, recognize the groups, look at the disability and how we can change the mindset to be more inclusive and not somebody's getting an advantage or there's an extra thing. It's care about everybody all the time, not just in a crisis situation. For me, I really believe that it is a lack of training and knowledge in there, not that it's a systemic problem, not that somebody has failed to implement something that's already in place. Sometimes it's just that they don't know what they don't know. And until they experience these things, there's no motivation behind it on their path. And so I think that this is a great time to find an opportunity to have these discussions and move forward and find ways to accommodate everybody. It really opens the eyes and of those who are now experiencing some of the things that people with disabilities experience on a daily basis. So they're better able to relate. So it's a ripe time for us to be having these conversations and trying to make a change. So I will hand the time over to Jeremy now.
Thanks, Ellie, and thanks, Maria. I think, listening to both of them has been eye-opening and inspiring, to say the least. I just graduated law school and I've been reflecting a lot on my experience. And I think one of the things that is, challenging for me to do even at this point is just to talk that I am disabled when I'm on an event like this or talking to people in the legal community. And I was so inspired by Maria opening hers up by just talking about what her disability is. Because I don't think if you are disabled, you know how challenging that is when you come into the legal community. I have ADHD, dyslexia, and dysgraphia. And I was very confident talking about my disability before going to law school. It felt like every job interview I had, all my friends knew about it. It was just part of me. I've been disabled my whole life, and it didn't bother me. When I got into law school, that kind of all changed. When I got to Harvard, I kind of thought I've been in public school my whole life. I thought I had reached the private school dream. Everything was going to be taken care of for me. We had all these resources. It was going to be great, fine and dandy. And, everything went south fast. My 1L year, I didn't get notes, and note-taking with my dysgraphia, for those of you who don't know, limits my ability to write legibly or even type effectively. And so note-taking is vital for me. And I didn't get notes till through the first 7 weeks of law school, my first semester. They had, this, that, and the other problem. And I understand human error or systems error, but that had a huge impact on me. Those in the legal community know your first semester of law school is crucial to your success as a lawyer and the early part of your career. And without without notes for the first 7 weeks, there was no way I was ever going to come back and dig myself out of that hole. And on top of that, the first professor I went to talk about this problem, to try to troubleshoot, I didn't really know who else to turn to, told me that I shouldn't talk about my disability in law school. I shouldn't talk about my disability to other professors because they would treat me differently. They wouldn't write me letters of recommendations if I wanted to get a clerkship because they would assume my grades were due to the fact that I was receiving double time or time and a half, which I didn't even tell them that I was receiving accommodations for testing. They assumed that based on my disability. And that was really challenging. It took me 3 years to get out of that hole. It took me friends like AJ, Maria, and Ellie, and everyone in the disabled community to really build me back up to have confidence to talk about my disability. And so I just want to highlight these stories, and I feel privileged being in my role as the president of the National Disabled Law Students Association. They get to talk to amazing law students across the country about their experiences. And I just want to emphasize that these aren't 3 stories, individual stories about 3 things that went wrong. These are all too common, and I hear about all these stories all too common. And if you're an administrator, if you're a professor, if you're at a law school and you're not disabled, you need to take a step back and recognize that this is probably happening in your environment, whether you like it or not. And there's active, proactive steps you can do to make this problem better for all of us. And I think one thing to highlight from Maria and Ellie and myself is listen to students with disabilities. When we come to talk to you in whatever role you are, listen to our experiences, validate us, and ask how you can help and listen to our ideas. I think the thing we don't talk about being disabled enough is what it does for us and its advantage. I've had to solve problems with one, in a different way from everyone going back to when I was in kindergarten. I feel like that has given me this really powerful strength to be a really creative problem solver and really understand problems from different ways. And so when I am problem solving with you, listen to what I'm suggesting, because I have thought about this problem for my entire life and I know what I need to be accommodated. And when you get to law school, it's a unique learning environment. Nowhere else cold calls, nowhere else does all these things in undergrad. And so that's going to face challenges. But administrators need to be there and listen and provide resources to help us. One thing that Maria and Ellie and I think have said at this point is asking for accommodations is a time-consuming process. So think about that for a second. We need our accommodations to be successful in these environments. We've now achieved our dreams, got to law school. It's a stepping stone to a better, the career that we've all been working super hard for. But we feel like we actually need these things to be successful. And we have to go to these meetings. We have to get the paperwork. We have to submit the paperwork. We have to follow up with you with an email. We have to send another email to schedule probably another meeting and get another call, and then come into your office and then talk about if it's being implemented right. And hopefully it's implemented right. And then, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. That's hours, days, weeks of work. And think about first semester of law school. I think many people on this call either are lawyers or work in the legal industry. It is an incredibly challenging time. It's the hardest academic semester of your life. I know it was for me. Those extra hours spent were taxing. They were almost an insurmountable odds at some point. And so, when I was at Harvard and I was working as the president of the Disabled Law Student Association there, we worked with 90 students over my 3 years to try to help them figure out that process. The number one thing I can say is administrators need to do a better job of project managing that task forward. If they can send those emails, if they can carry that task forward and take that little lift off of students, doesn't matter if it's COVID or regular, after this pandemic, that's going to make our lives better. And you're going to see students staying in the accommodations process longer. So what often happens is by second semester 1L or by 2L, students are just like, you know what, I give up. I'm going to try to do my best and accommodate myself. And that doesn't often go well, and it impacts students' grades. The other thing I will say, just to highlight what Maria and Ellie are I've already said, is COVID is a challenging time for everyone, but particularly for students with disabilities. And so I think administrators need to do two things: is, open the door to new accommodations, lower the threshold for any documentation or process you need in order for us to get accommodations. It is too hard to, I just had to apply for accommodations for the bar. I had to get 3 doctor's notes. You know how hard it is to call a doctor during a pandemic? They do not, they're happy to help with me, but they have more important things to do right now than answer my phone call. And it is, imperative that you become more flexible in how you help students with disabilities on this. Second is, you got to think about it in the fact that this is really about universal access and design, right? If you build a system that works for everyone, and including people with disabilities, everyone's going to benefit. I had asked for 3 years for class recordings at Harvard Law School, and I had every excuse or legitimate reason, honestly, thrown under the sun for me. Professors don't want to do it. It's too hard. It's too expensive. It's too technical. How do we do it? But I think one thing people forgot is, how are people learning? That's the goal of law school, right? Is to learn how to be a lawyer. And, everyone, potentially could benefit from watching a lecture twice, or maybe you have something going on that day and you're not prepared for class. You didn't do the reading, which is a human thing. I know it's impossible to talk about in law school that you might have showed up to class without reading, but it happens to the best of us. And you might want to watch that lecture again because it's a tough subject. If the goal is that we learn the law and become good lawyers, what is the argument for taping class for everyone? There isn't an argument that really resonates with me. And we saw that with Zoom. I think that it really opened a lot of my peers, abled and disabled eyes, that, wow, this was super helpful. I really liked doing this. I really liked being able to watch lecture before the test on double time or time and a half, or go back to that one section because I didn't really understand it. And then when the professor talked about it on week 10, I got to connect to week 2. If that's the goal of all of us, it should be a no-brainer. And the last thing I want to say is this ableism effect. People with disabilities who are on the call, we need to get better at calling out ableism. It's tough, it's challenging, it's really uncomfortable to do. But we have to empower ourselves that when we hear that, you know, I wish I could get in a time machine, go back to my 1L self, and that professor said that to me, and I wish I could just look him in the eyes and say, that was a realist comment. And let me take a second to educate you on your perspectives. And educate, and, you know, administrators need to empower that too, and recognize that we may all have, you know, myself included, unconscious bias towards this. And I, you know, might not know the lingo, might not know what's safe, and we might feel uncomfortable. We just need to get better. And this also applies to professors. If you are a professor who thinks that time and a half or double time, you know, takes advantage of the test or people cheating it, it's not on me as a disabled person to make you feel better. You're the professor. Design a test in which time doesn't matter. That's not that hard to do. The onus is on you. You know, that's what people can do, those things. And if you really think you can do that, go ahead and do that. And don't put the pressure on me as a person with disability to make a change, because that's not where we should put the onus. And that's not how justice works. That's not how anything should work. And so that's, you know, my comments for the day. I know we're going to go to the Q&A section, but I also just want to one more time highlight Maria and Ellie, both in law school. I think it's really, you know, important we listen to law students and in these events and hear about their experiences and amplify them. And I really appreciate both of them jumping on this call to talk about these experiences. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone did too. But AJ, I'm going to get back to you to ask the questions around. I'm excited to hear what everyone thinks.
Great. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you for sharing your stories and being so open about it. I know that I've talked to Jeremy several times, and we both feel it's really important for people to just see that disabled folks are amazing and are wonderful, can do things, and to have that representation is so important. So I really appreciate all of you sharing it. There are quite a few questions in the chat. So the first one is, do you have suggestions of how to help students navigate exams such as the LSAT and accommodations in light of COVID-19? And I'll open that up to anyone.
I can jump in if Maria or Ellie don't have any thoughts. Yeah, so, you know, I think navigating the LSAT or the NPRE in this environment is challenging. I think one, you know, these organizations, you know, I'll say are working, you know, if the LSAT particularly is working with NDLSA to try to figure out how to do this, but, you know, mixed results. So my realistic advice is start early, apply for accommodations earlier than you think. Hit the ground running is, you know, as frustrating as to say, I wish you could wait till your peers were to think about those things, but unfortunately the reality is you probably need to start it earlier than that to get your accommodations in place. But don't panic. Don't let it seem like this overburden that's too hard to get. A lot of people are going through what you're going through. There's a great community to support online. The Facebook group, which I think AJ can post in the chat, is a phenomenal place to just be surrounded by other people with disabilities going through the same thing and get some words of encouragement or figure out how to navigate any individual problems. Feel free to also email me. I can put my email in the chat, but it's just jeremy.wertz@ndlsa.org. And we can chat about individual concerns about paperwork or, you know, how to navigate what to ask for, what not to ask for. But the one thing I'll say is just, you can do it. I know pandemic's a unique challenge, but I'll also say being a person with disability gives you unique resiliency. We're used to challenges. We're used to having to work that extra mile, even though we shouldn't, to get things done. But now is the time during a pandemic where that extra strength comes and is a really inherent advantage. And it doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem right, because it's not, but, you know, you can do it. I encourage you to go to law school, become a lawyer, become one of us, so we can all fight to make this whole thing better.
I think my feedback would be to make sure you're using your resources. I use the Educational Access Center at my undergrad school, and my advisor there was super helpful. The other thing that I would suggest with anybody with disability moving forward into law school is document. Record when you sent the email, when you made the phone call, if you left a message, and you keep everything. That has saved me more often than not. I can't stress that enough. But make sure you're using the resources that you have. Reach out to NDLSA or the Facebook group, your EAC, wherever you can find somebody who has a knowledge of that. I know that even the Educational Access Center at my previous law school was willing to help. The accommodations wasn't as knowledgeable, but there was a person there with a master's in special education, and she was also on top of helping that. Ask questions, find out early.
Yeah, I definitely echo what Jeremy and Ellie are saying. You know, use your resources, start early. I remember that for the LSAT, I actually was told that I had to wait until the next cycle, because I guess it was past the date when you're supposed to submit the request for accommodations. So make sure to check when that deadline is. That way it's not something that will surprise you when you, when you're ready to send your documentation for the LSAT. As far as the MPRE, for example, I'm trying to seek my accommodations for the MPRE. There's a section where they ask for your test scores for the ACT, the SAT, and I took those exams like 10 years ago. But on the topic of being resourceful, I actually outreached to my undergraduate institution because I thought maybe they would have those test scores, and they did. So, think outside the box in that sense and reach out to your disability services center and career counselors.
Great, thank you. The next question is a 4-part question, so I'll try not to be too confusing. The first part is, how many of your professors have come out as people with disabilities, and how important is that to you as a student? The second part is, do you find that other students are open about being students with disabilities in your institutions? The third part is, how can professors create a supportive community? And then the last part is, also, students can be powerful lobbyists for disability law curriculum. Do your law schools have robust programs? And if not, how have you advanced this issue? I will open that up to anyone.
To anyone.
I personally, no, sorry, Ellie, you can go.
I haven't had any professors at law school personally disclose to me. I did have some at undergrad, but I did have some professors that reached out at the beginning of spring semester and said, if you didn't do as good as you should have done, and if there might be a disability that you should have disclosed and got accommodations for, please do that. It was not all of my professors, but it was more of a, this is an acceptable thing, don't be afraid of it. However, if you went to have an individual talk with them regarding it, they were much more standoffish. They're very afraid of that, like I spoke earlier, the FERPA and the violation of anonymity for grading purposes and everything else. And so that's still not dealt well. My university did not have any kind of student organization or anything like that to go to. I think how the professors and stuff could be more supportive in the community is being able to have some resources to understand where that FERPA, HIPAA line is to be able to talk and disclose. For me, it feels very ridiculous that you wouldn't be able to acknowledge some things that might come up in class. If you're going to have tics or something else or seizures, the teacher might want to know that so that they're not as shocked if something happens. There are good disclosures. I did disclose to one of my professors, and I said I have ADD, and these are, I'm focusing on class, so I may not be raising my hand as much because I want to focus. Can I come to you after class and ask questions? And he was like, let's set up a weekly meeting and we'll just do this. And so that was great. So some of them are receptive. It just really depends on their experience. And I think overall for me, that's what I find that's missing, is until you have an experience with a disability or somebody with it, you don't understand all the things that they're going through, and so they're unable to relate, and they just kind of blow it off, especially if it's an invisible disability.
Yeah,
I'm looking at, what was the fourth one, AJ?
You're on mute, AJ.
I almost made it through the whole thing without doing that. The fourth part is, students can be powerful lobbyists for a disability law curriculum. Does your law school have a robust program? And if not, how have you tried to advance this issue?
So even advocating for myself at my previous law school or asking about programs was seen as being confrontational and disrespectful, which is kind of odd to me considering they're teaching us to be advocates. So that is complicated there. However, I'm getting ready to start UNLI. They reached out to me this morning to tell me good luck with this conference and everything else, and they are much more supportive and open. They have a disability rights class. I'm not sure about all the curriculum because I'm new, but they have some different pieces there that they're willing to pursue and work with certain opportunities based on my interest to provide opportunities for me. So.
Great. I'll allow the speakers to answer that if they want to.
Sorry, I think Ellie crushed it entirely. I just want to add two or three quick things. So one, representation is incredibly important. I think hiring professors with disabilities, but also administrators with disabilities in the disability advocacy office is incredibly important. But for professors who are not disabled, I challenge you to bring disability as a perspective into the classroom. For 3 years in law school, if we had a case that dealt with race, gender, any of these other issues in negative or positive ways, that was a central theme of the discussion. I cannot tell you once about a time that a professor talked about when disability was, talked about in a case, negative or positive way that brought that into the discussion. Think about torts. Torts is an entire area of law where we're valuing you oftentimes monetarily about how someone's life is made worse because they became disabled. And some of these cases are so horribly written, and not a single time did a professor ever be like, hey, let's take a step back and think about this. What does this mean for the disabled community? What does this mean for ableism? How is this an ableist opinion? And I think professors can really bring in this perspective and challenge students' notions, and maybe able-bodied students who have not thought about these issues before can be thinking about them for the first time. And it can make students feel very comfortable to talk about their own experiences and bring in their own insights. And I think that's what the Socratic method is supposed to do. And that's what law school is supposed to do in its best form. And I think professors who really take that onus and feel comfortable doing that. The other thing I'll say is to add to this is how many students feel comfortable being open about their disability on campus? No. I think, I when I was at Harvard, one program that we started that I would really encourage every administrator to duplicate is when you have to request accommodations, it can feel incredibly adversarial. You often have to go to a room, particularly what's on law school. At our school, it could go all the way to the dean of students is the person who's finally would make the decision if you got an accommodation or not. And you're often having to prove that you are disabled and you deserve this accommodation, and it's framed in rights, it's framed in a conversation. It can feel very tough to do that. And we don't expect, if I'm going to pass the bar and become a lawyer, if I ever have any issue, I don't ever expect to represent myself in court, because you're never your best advocate when you are having to articulate these things. So we would provide a student allies, what we'd call them, who'd go into these meetings and articulate on that student's behalf with them, and would carry that conversation forward and be able to push. And actually, we had much better outcomes on both sides when we had one of these advocates in place. I only mention this is because through my 3 years there, we served, I personally represented as a student advocate for 92, 93 students. And I would see them in the halls, and we both knew that we were both disabled. And I would say of that, maybe 10 were comfortable acknowledging their disability and even showing up to a disabled law students meeting or to me outside of those rooms. But they, as soon as, and it was incredibly vital that those resources existed. But I think it talks about how much more we have to go that students feel comfortable being themselves on campus. And I would always talk about that to professors, to the deans on law school, because I don't think people understand that delta and how challenging that is, right? Like, imagine being in an environment like law school, talking about these issues, being challenged, to think things broadly, and you don't even feel comfortable amongst your peers about this core identity of yourself. And to me, it is a challenge amongst all of us to make a community that people feel comfortable being themselves on campus.
I think just knowing that there is a support there, even if you don't access it, there's somebody to talk to. The other point that I would make for that I see as an issue, there are the people making the decisions, like the dean of students or the dean over accommodations, who have no training in any of this area. There's nothing that is systemically required to have that role, and they're making decisions based on their limited experience that may be contrary to what the doctors are saying. And that's a discussion that needs to happen as well.
I was just going to add that on my particular campus, it took me being tired of the status quo and starting an organization with other students. I reached out to some folks that I knew would be, willing to do it with me. And, we're in the process of starting an organization for students with disabilities. But, I feel like, yes, it's difficult to open up about that aspect of your identity when there's such a big stigma. And I think that, that rule where you can't disclose anything to professors makes it difficult for students to just be more, yes, we're resourceful, but it just cuts our wings when we can't even speak to our professors about certain things. I remember there was an instance where we had quizzes in a particular class, and the professor thought that by making it untimed, it was going to accommodate for everybody. And, just extended time is not the only accommodation that students require. And so, eventually I was able to speak to the professor, and they accommodated me, and I was able to test by myself per my accommodations. But, some other student who also has ADHD or any other disability may not have done that. And I don't think that it should be an individual student getting, who is more open about this aspect of their identity, speaking up, and then them, getting accommodations. I think it should be more established, and everybody had access to have their accommodations. So yeah, as far as the students being advocates amongst each other, I think that sometimes, yeah, it takes, maybe the school should have an organization, and if they fear that there's not going to be enough members, then that also tells them something about their outreaching. Like, you need to be recruiting more students with disabilities, and then there's going to be people that are going to be on these, organizations. So yeah, it's a very holistic approach that needs to be taken.
I think that's a great way to end that question, Maria, because the next question is, do you think law schools, when they're talking about diversity, need to be making more of an emphasis on students with disabilities? And do you think it would be good to do that? But also, before we get into that question, that's for all the panelists, I would just say, if you're a student on this call, or you're at an institution that's looking to form an org, the National Disabled Law Students Association does have resources for folks who are looking to start student organizations so that you can build that community. So yeah, I'll open that question up to any panelists.
If I can jump in here real quick. I think it is important for every lawyer or administrator or law professor on this call to recognize and educate yourself why this is such a problem. I'm surprised, this isn't more common knowledge, but I figured this out the hard way. So when I was applying for law school, as an undergrad, the first thing I ever heard of was, you have a disability. It's from Berkeley's Disabled Students Office, and you want to go to law school. I hate to be the one to bear the bad news, but you probably should try to pick a different career, because the LSAT is this huge barrier and they don't provide accommodations. And if they do provide accommodations to you, they're going to flag your test score, and it's not going to be weighed the same with respective law schools. So you're probably not going to get into law school. That was a really hard thing to hear as a 19-year-old in undergrad, when I had really wanted to go to law school my whole life. And so I, interned at the Department of Justice Disability Rights section when they were suing the LSAC, and they finally settled and all that got changed. But those changes didn't get implemented until 2015, 2016. So really, me and AJ's year, the three of us who graduate, kind of represent this first wave of students who were finally able to get past this barrier that was put in place by the LSAC. And I think it's really important for law schools to recognize the systemic injustice that was going on for decades with the LSAT that prevented people like me and like our panelists here from getting to law school. It wasn't anything that we were less studious, that we were worse students, we were bad academics, we didn't want to be lawyers. It was this barrier that was in place. And to me, law schools need to recognize their role in it. They were validating the LSAT as the way to get, you had to take it to go to law school, and need to make sure that they're providing new resources and extra, recruitment efforts to make sure that they're now filling those numbers and making sure that we get equal representation in the legal community and make up for years of being behind. And I had to find out that law schools didn't know this when I wrote this, what I thought was a great letter, application essay that I worked like 3 months on that told all the story. And I got on the first call with a law school that won't be named. And they're like, this didn't happen. This law school, LSAT provided accommodations. And I was like, I had to Google the lawsuit and send it to this interviewer in the middle of my law school application interview to confirm that I was not just making up this story. And I think it is something that I've now told to professors and administrators and people and deans. And I think they're just not aware that this was going on, which again is surprising to me, but I think it is important we all recognize the role we all played in getting where we're at and how we need to fix that. But I think I'll pass it to Ellie and Maria to provide better resources on how you actually get that recruitment done.
You want to go first, Maria?
I think that schools will make the argument that they can't straight up ask somebody, right, about a disability, which is true. But if somebody comes to you, to your table, and tells you, I have this disability, what resources does your school have for me as a prospective student that is thinking about attending your school? You should, that tells you that the student is seeking support as a prospective applicant. And, also, if you don't have any resources for them, then that also, you need to critically start considering changes to your school, but, I think that there's this other part of stigma to outreaching students, where for some reason, some people say that if you have a disability, it's not part of diversity, which I think is ridiculous. The first time I heard that argument, I was like, what are you talking about? And that's something else that needs to be changed in people's perspectives. Like, it's not true. So I think people who are in these admissions outreach committees need to be better trained as to how to talk to students who have disabilities, how to outreach for students with disabilities. And even the schools themselves need to have resources that, in order to actually be able to support students once they are at their institutions. And I think they're only doing themselves a disservice if they don't outreach to students who have disabilities.
I would just add to that, as the disabled students, we need to make sure that we are presenting ourselves not as a victim or not as somebody looking for a handout, but as an advocate for equity in access to education, and that we're trying to promote knowledgeable resources and expand everybody's knowledge and experience when dealing with these things. If you come off as a victim and angry, it just diminishes everything you're moving forward. And that's not to say there's not going to be 100 times that you're going to want to quit and that you're going to cry and stomp your feet and eat a gallon of ice cream. It happens to all of us. But the attitude with which you present yourself, and that you are who you are and you're just moving this forward, it makes a difference in how you feel about yourself and present yourself, because you don't need somebody to feel sorry for you and do this. This is a legitimate issue. That would be the part that we have to be responsible for. And while you can advocate, you don't have to be combative.
Great, thank you so much. There are so many wonderful questions, and I'm so sorry if I can't get to all of them. It's really hard. Yeah, I don't know. I'm so sorry that I'm not prepared to pick one. This is just a comment that turns into a question. I find it discouraging for students of the requirement of needing to have an up-to-date evaluation to show proof of disability. It's not possible often in times of COVID-19. B, it cannot be done online, and C, it goes against the ADA and Section 504 definition of disability. A person should not have to prove again that they have a disability. So I guess maybe if you could talk more about the battle of trying to prove that you're disabled, or kind of obstacles that you face personally.
You want me to take that one? Don't want to keep jumping in here, but I know for me, my disabilities are invisible, and so it's very hard. I assume others have similar experiences, that when you're dealing with anxiety and auditory processing learning disabilities and such, that they assume that everybody has these, they're just a made up thing. And so finding a support person at the school that does not have a bias against it in the first place and will believe the documentation is really hard. And it's just a struggle. I know that my doctors were getting really irritated with how many times I was having to come back for additional documentation, and they eventually told the school that it seems like there's a discrimination issue going on here with you not applying accommodations, and we have a duty to report. And after that, things started to move a little bit better, but it's a battle with knowledge and stigma of what people believe are a true disability and what needs help and what doesn't.
Thank you so much. I think that's it. We're getting close to time. So we will try to wrap this up. I just want to thank all the panelists for sharing their stories and for being on here. And I really appreciate it. Also, thank you to everyone who tuned in. Just know that I posted the links to some resources in the chat if you want to check that out, if you're looking for community or any other kind of resources. So thank you for joining us for this free webinar. We'd also like to express our gratitude to this esteemed group of panelists. You could tell I'm reading the thing now because I already said that. You are all doing such critical work, and we thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to share your experiences. The section of Civil Rights and Social Justice provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope this helps you in your work. And again, if you can, please consider joining and becoming active in the ABA. You may do so at ambar.org/CRSJ. You can find information on other free programs on the CRSJ webpage. Best of luck to everyone in your work, and please stay safe. Thank you for tuning in, y'all.